Good evening. My name is Veronica Medina. I am the producer and curator of the Museum of Political Corruption Disrupt film series. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan institution dedicated to educating and empowering the public by providing a better understanding of political corruption and encouraging solutions that promote ethics reform and honest governance. I am very pleased to welcome you all tonight to our first screening event of 2024. This is the third year of the Disrupt film series, and it has been such an honor for us to have presented a great number of insightful films and hosted many meaningful conversations over these last 3 years. From the unequivocal corruption in institutional politics to gun violence, from the state of welfare programs to racism, from gender issues to citizen activism, we have covered a wide range of topics in our events. But this is not just another year. In 2024, more than half of the world's population will go to polls, making it the biggest election year in history. According to the Freedom in the World report, published last year by the Freedom House, political rights and civil liberties have been declining globally for 17 consecutive years. So with such pivotal elections that are ahead of us, democracy itself is on the ballot. The right to vote is not merely a privilege, but a hard-won achievement that symbolizes the essence of political legitimacy and civic engagement. As we prepare for 2024, let us embrace this opportunity with reverence for those who have fought and continue to fight for this fundamental right. Let us remember those who have struggled and have given their lives for these freedoms. And above all, let's remember that democracy is not just on the ballot, it is in our hands. And it's precisely this confidence that we can create positive change and ignite change around the world that all of us at the Museum of Political Corruption work really hard to uphold the principles of democracy for generations to come. So in this spirit, in honor of our commitment to the fight for democracy today and every day, that we are pleased to be presenting throughout the year 4 films that spotlight relevant perspectives on what's at stake in this election cycle and what that means for the future and stability of political institutions. Starting off a series of such momentous conversations is the documentary Undivide US. Leading tonight's discussion is a fellow trustee of the Museum of Political Corruption, E. Scott Osborne. Scott is a writer, lawyer, and nonprofit manager with a passion for sustainable development, education, and gender equity issues. She has lived on 7 countries in 4 continents, working with schools, international development agencies, and local nonprofits. Good evening, Scott, and thank you so much for guiding this conversation tonight.
Good evening, Veronica. Good evening, everyone. And thank you for that wonderful introduction for tonight's topic. For those of you not familiar with the museum, let me just say one word about us. We were founded in 2013, so we're over 10 years old now. And we are a nonpartisan, not-for-profit organization dedicated to empowering and educating people about political issues, about corruption, and about ethical governance. So it's in that spirit that we do this Disrupt film series, as well as a number of other events. We have a wonderful online museum. So I encourage you to look us up. So thank you. As Veronica mentioned, though, tonight's topic couldn't be more important. You know, there are many divisions in our society today, and our diversity should be one of our crowning glories as Americans, as a nation of immigrants. And yet at the moment, it almost seems like democratic suicide. It seems like a gridlock. So this film explores that topic, and it explores a really foundational part of that topic, which is, how do we talk to one another? How do we communicate? Can we communicate? How do we see each other and understand one another? That's almost a threshold issue before we put any topic on the table. So we're really delighted to have this film with us tonight. We're going to show you a short trailer. We hope many of you have seen it. We're going to show you the trailer, and then I'll introduce 3 wonderful guests who are with us tonight from the film and get right into the issues. So if we could hear the trailer now, please.
Bad is the GOP.
You called it 2 Americas that are divided.
How do civil wars get started, and how close do you think is the United States?
These screens that are in our homes and in our pockets, they put forth this story about America, that we're on the edge of civil war, that we can't get along, and the danger is that we might start to believe that.
Perhaps if we created the opportunity for folks to come together, giving them an opportunity to talk and explore ideas on, controversial issues.
Could you really get regular people from all kinds of different lives, really put them together and get them talking about hard stuff? Like, is that doable?
I think we should try.
We've got just a remarkable opportunity to kind of create something special that nobody's ever done before. We'll pick an issue. We know there's dozens of controversial issues, and then we'll go out and find people who are leaning one direction, and we'll find folks who are leaning the other direction.
Leaning Democratic.
I'm independent. I'm a moderate Republican. Left of liberal, by a good amount.
How deep does it go? Does the average person feel that anger all the time? Or is it the political elites who profit from anger and division? Are they the ones who are the problem? Well, Ben, I'm going to be bringing in some regular people and asking about some tough issues, and you're going to be there at the table with them. If we don't get regular citizens talking again, disagreeing, and doing it respectfully, doing it way better than Washington does, it seems like there's a lot at stake if we don't figure that out.
We're going to jump in together, my friend.
This film brings up so many wonderful topics, so let's get right into it. First with us is Kristi Kendall, the filmmaker and director of UNDIVIDE US. For 20 years, Kristi has produced or directed hundreds of short-form and long-form documentaries that have been seen on a wide variety of platforms, including Netflix, Fox Business, and Amazon Prime. She's screened at film festivals from Heartland to Sundance. Kristi leverages the power of stories to move hearts and create impact. Also with us is Ben Klutsey, who you've seen in the film. He's the Director of Academic Outreach and the Director of Program on Pluralism and Civil Exchange at George Mason University in Washington, D.C. His specialty is collaboration. He facilitates outreach to faculty leaders and university centers to foster collaboration and knowledge sharing about building academic programs. And Jasmine Ramsey is a program director at a group called Beyond Conflict, an organization that develops new tools to solve real-world problems. Jasmine leads initiatives that explore identity, trauma, narratives, and norms in the context of democracy strengthening, social cohesion, and collective resilience. She's also a restorative justice facilitator and works with hate crime perpetrators and victims in their communities. Jasmine has served as an advisor on security and humanitarian responses, domestically and internationally. Welcome, welcome, everyone. We're delighted to have you with us today.
Thanks you for having us.
There's so many topics to dive into, but I do want to start with Kristi. Kristi, if you could tell us a little bit just why this film and give us kind of your shared version of what your idea was and how it came to pass.
Yeah, people always ask me, how did you know it was going to be so crazy? And I was like, have you looked at the media lately? And really what drove me to make the film was thinking about I was a journalist, as you mentioned. And so I kind of have this journalistic tendency to look at a situation and also look where things don't seem to be syncing up, right? And I definitely had this sense that this narrative around how completely divided we were, we are, and how Americans just can't have conversations together. And I thought, well, if that's the future of our country, my kids are in really big trouble. That does not bode well for what's coming down the pike. So I started doing some research, and I came across a book by Ben's co-collaborator and in this, Tony Woodleaf, called I, Citizen. And Tony in the book really points out this very basic but really important fact about our citizenry, which is that while we do have two extremes in this country, the vast majority of us are in the middle of the bell curve, and we are actually human beings who can have conversations with one another. Yet, because of the extremes are the parts that dominate the media cycle and our political conversation, the people in the middle, the vast majority of us, have this perception that the extremes actually are what your fellow, Democrat or Republican is like.
That's what you would think watching the news or reading the newspaper, by all means, yes.
Right. We would all think that. And I thought to myself, well, all Americans need to know this fact. And so I thought, well, the only thing that I know how to do is make a documentary, like, or make content. And so I'm going to do the thing that I know how to do to try to tell this story. And so we tried to tell it in a way that was as authentic and, as compelling as you can. And so we thought, okay, if regular Americans think they can't have these conversations, let's show regular Americans having conversations about really, really hard things. And let's not like take the easy things. Let's talk about abortion and guns and the elections and see if they actually can do this around the country. And let's try to pick people who regular Americans will resonate with and see themselves in. And so that was our whole thing.
So you set yourself up to film this, but I get the impression Ben has done this a lot before. At least that's the impression from the film. So Ben, is that right? I mean, I had that clear, distinct impression.
No. Very first time doing this. And there was a little bit of trepidation going into it. It was a little scary, but we were interested in finding out,
So how did you come to this kind of collaboration work?
Oh, well, I run a program at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, which is called Pluralism and Civil Exchange. And that work, is based on trying to answer this question: how can we live together and coexist amidst deep divides and differences? And the reason that we were trying to explore this question is because, we are an ideas organization. And when we look around, we realize how difficult it's becoming to have real conversations around ideas. People are yelling at each other, it seemed to us, and screaming at each other, especially in the sort of ideas circles, right? We talk about elite polarization, which is an important aspect of this stuff too. So that's what we're seeing. And so we wanted to explore this. And so we were doing this with students in terms of having conversations across divides on college campuses and learning a lot from those experiences. Students seemed very appreciative of the opportunity to talk to, folks that they never interact with. Some of the things that we hear from students like, wow, I never had the chance to talk to a conservative student, right? And we were thinking, this is wild. But that's what we were doing. And then I, talked to Kristi, and she was, doing this work, and, I
convinced him. I suckered him into it.
Kristi can be very convincing. So
I just told him if he wanted to save the world for his children, he would participate in the documentary.
And that did it. But Ben, I'm dying to know some big takeaways, though. I mean, obviously, there's many takeaways from the film and the topics we can get into. But you say you're putting together, for example, college students and they're feeling they never sort of talk across the divide. What else really stood out in your findings from that?
From the movie or from my work with students?
Well, just do your work from students first.
Yeah. I think the excitement after the opportunities, because, they come in worried as well. They come in scared because from what they've heard, we can't talk to each other. And sometimes these are difficult issues, whether it's about, socioeconomic issues or economic issues, healthcare, and all these things that people are very emotional about. And so they coming into these conversations, they're worried. But the amazing thing is that afterwards, they just don't want to leave. They're still talking to each other. They're exchanging text messages and emails and getting on each other's like Instagram and all these things. And, some of the students will write to us and say, hey, I met up with this other student in New York when I was visiting. And, I know that they're on opposite sides of the political spectrum. And I was like, wow, that's pretty cool. And so that's, very, very exciting, something that we realized from conversation with students. And it gave me some insight about how this might happen as well across the country, even though we had no idea for sure what was going to happen. I figured that, hey, the average American adults who are, busy doing their work and involved in all kinds of things, this kind of engagement, I don't know, they may not like it very much, but it was different. We learned something really cool.
Interesting. So let me ask one thing that seems to be a burning subtext in the whole film is the role of media. Could we talk about that for a minute? Anyone, and how much are popular or corporate media are really fueling this? I mean, what were your real thoughts on that after the whole project?
Yeah, I mean,
Ben, you want to start?
Kristi's a journalist, so I'd rather have her weigh in, but I think that the news, it sort of feeds off of, sensationalism, and, negative news kind of sells. In fact, false news sells a lot. And there's a lot of interesting research that says that, misinformation is a lot more viral than, facts that are true, information that's based on facts that are true.
I feel like that's like our next documentary is like what is truth is like with the advent of AI and anyway, I feel like that's like a whole, people have started asking me about that, and that's where my wheels are starting to turn, like, oh, these are interesting questions.
Yeah, people are worried about, what to believe, they don't know what to believe. But the more negative and sensational the news is, the more people are kind of curious about them. And so that certainly gives the impression that this is the nature of the world. And I think that's very sad.
I think that's sad. And I agree that like, I view media as like a double-edged sword, though, right? Like, it is capable of amazing good and amazing evil. And it really comes back to who wields the sword, right? And ultimately, I feel like we as consumers of media have to take much more responsibility for what we're clicking on and what we're giving power to in our lives. And I feel like that kind of ethos of responsible consumerism when it comes to journalism is actually really an important conversation we need to be having more of at this point. Because the other solutions, I mean, I just don't see a ton of other great solutions at the table, when it comes
Yeah, but I think people are busy, right? So
that's true.
They will want to take the shortcut. What's this pundit saying about this? Or this person seems like an expert and they might know what's going on.
Right.
They're likely to kind of, assume that what they're saying is correct and, believe it. So it's not like, I think people want to be appropriately informed, but they just have busy lives to research and track these things.
Well, and it's interesting too. Oh, sorry, Scott. It's interesting too, thinking about, this upcoming generation that has been raised on social media and without safeguards around misinformation and disinformation spreading. I mean, it's a huge risk of like, what is media literacy today, and what are people expected? What is responsible consumerism on particularly social media? Because as you both are sharing, I mean, clearly mass media and more regulated media still fans the flames of hyper polarized rhetoric, because that's what sells and what people are really interested in listening to. And, at Beyond Conflict, we look at a lot of the social science that's underpinning our polarization and the psychology that underpins these divides, and looking at just the fundamental functions of the brain and what's clickable, what's going to meet that satisfactory moment of brief engagement is whatever is going to be the most kind of extreme. Unfortunately, I recently saw on my own social media some new research that is really interesting that says, and they're doing actually this lab, I'll have to find the name, but they're looking at, that there's about 25% of the most popular posts on social media, or sorry, 80% of the most popular social media posts are done by 25% of people that are actually on there. So it's the same kind of, Kristi, what you're talking about from the beginning. It's the same kind of bell curve that we're seeing of who's really controlling the narrative that's influencing then our norms and our perceptions and then our behaviors in really dramatic ways, is still reduced to this smaller population that tends to be on the more extreme ends of the, at least, political spectrum.
Okay, so the media doesn't help us in this, and I think Americans are pretty bad at that kind of critical media literacy, as you say. But I have another thought. I've read some social science that looks at the forces of globalization and large corporate bureaucracies and so many of these things that many Americans feel are affecting their lives and are sort of nameless and faceless. And we've all become very anonymous, you know, and you can't get any helpline with a real person. And, you know, these kind of small frustrations that many people feel in their daily lives. And are we taking that out kind of against one another in our anger and polarization at our neighbors because we can't really seem to get at these larger things, these economic forces that are disturbing our lives? Do you think there's anything to that?
Absolutely. I mean, and I'm going to let Ben and Jasmine talk more about this, but I want you guys should talk about, there are amazing studies that show that if you label somebody on the other side of any issue, you are going to characterize them as much more extreme than they actually are. And so, but if you actually go and talk to that person and like live in local community with them, you find that their views are much more nuanced and less extreme than your perception of them, and vice versa. So like that is, to me, that's kind of getting at what you're talking about, Scott, right? Like that we have this like narrative in our head about like all these micro, like not micro, they're real big frustrations, right? In terms of like what's going on in the world. But when we then label and take those out on each other, that is what kind of leads, I think, to a lot of unnecessary aggression that's actually misplaced based on these weird perception cycles that we set up in our brains.
Yeah. I mean, the misperceptions are like priming people to be in a stress response, right? They're like, we're already entering in a conversation with all of these assumptions and our bodies are already starting to act up. We're like feeling tension in our chest, that like pressure in our foreheads. Like we're ready to go at our keyboard. We're ready to go at whoever we're like, you know, kind of starting to screen and scan in the grocery store or whatever as being an out-group member or somebody that doesn't believe the same things as us. And so when we're in this state of almost constant like hyper or even hypo arousal, where we're like, you know, pushing things away and starting to numb out from the news cycle because it's too stressful to engage with, then it just creates this really collective weakening of the ability for us to collectively solve shared challenges and to really recognize each other's, you know, inherent humanity, and also to know that they will also see our inherent humanity, because so much of these responses are just defensive to keep our own selves safe and to keep, you know, our families or our communities safe. We want to just push away. And that creates more of this self kind of segregation and siloing in all of our different ecosystems, from where we work, where we play, where we take our kids to play. We have all of these different buckets that then we're just creating, you know, it's almost like borders around ourselves of exposure that then just make us more likely to see other people outside of that as a threat.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, there's just so much happening around us, so much angst. When you know, think about the nature of polarization, you know, we are sort of overestimating the extent to which the other side is extreme. And if you think that the other side has extreme views and that their views are dangerous, they are a threat to your existence, you want to hold even more extreme views as sort of a protective mechanism against them. And so we are kind of one-upping each other on this sort of sense of extremism. But a lot of the fear and concern and anxiety sometimes has to do with the broader institutional you know, sort of architecture that we're seeing, and it goes to what you said, Scott, about what people are experiencing about faceless things, right? I mean, but if you look at the U.S. in particular, you know, you look at institutions and the lack of trust of institutions, and it goes back decades, right? My colleague, you know, Martin Gurry writes about the revolt of the public, that go back to the Iraq War, you know, weapons of mass destruction that they never found, or the financial crisis when they said that, you know, everything is fine and we'll be okay, and then things aren't fine, they were not okay. Even fairly recently, you look at COVID, all the sort of things they got wrong, and obviously things are moving pretty fast, and so we're learning as we're moving along, but it just creates a sense of a lack of trust, right, in the institutions that people always sort of had some level of trust. Now, Americans have always harbored a very healthy skepticism of institutions. I think that's okay. But what we've seen in the past few decades sort of kind of worsened our sense of trust of institutions. But along with that, we've seen a decline in social trust. Kevin Valley has a great book called Trust in a Polarized Age. And he says across Western democracies, the United States is seeing the steepest decline in social trust. We have a hard time trusting each other because of the phenomenon around misperceptions of views. And if you think that the other person is, or the person with that label of red or blue is a threat to my existence, you're going to have a really hard time trusting them. So we have all these phenomena in the system, and it's affecting sort of the way that we are polarized.
So how much of this do you think, I don't know if we can pull this apart, is due to the diversity of our society? Small, homogeneous societies often have much wider social networks and high levels of trust. They know, they understand, they look like one another. We are, by our very nature, phenomenally diverse. I mean, does that make our trust that much harder?
Sure. America, I'd say that was built to run this experiment in pluralism, coexisting across differences and divides. But it's changing, right? Some of the most celebrated democracies in history, were homogeneous, and some of the most democratic societies or multi-ethnic societies throughout history have not been democracies. So for the first time in world history, not just in the United States, we're seeing large, growing, multi-ethnic, multi-ideological, democracies with different narratives that are emerging about, where the country should go, what it should be, what should be the identity of these democracies, and so on. So we are in a bit of a different territory right now, and we're learning as we're going along. So we're going through some growing pains, I have to say.
But Ben, wouldn't you say though that one of the most incredible things about this country is its diversity? The diversity of America is its strength. And I would challenge the idea that we are so much more divided than we ever have been, because I would argue that in fact this country was founded in a with Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, who hated each other's guts and did not see things the same way. That actually part of this country, and we've had a civil war, right? It hasn't always gone well, but we actually have learned how to flourish, and part of this American experiment is based on pluralism and is based on this idea of our liberal values can actually still bind us. And the liberal values I'm talking about are mutual respect, allowing people to live and let live, preserving the citizenship and the rights of our fellow citizens. Those kind of ideals that should apply to everyone. When the founding obviously didn't get that all right, but with any of us on this call, actually, but those values, I mean, I don't know. I would argue that those are we have to kind of reinvest a little in some of those values.
Yeah, and I think America's done pretty well. And sorry, I'll shut up so that Jasmine, you can chime in here. But I think
you should go to dinner with me.
I love it. I love it.
I think that we have, done well to sort of reconstruct the country over, the past couple of centuries, right? From women's suffrage, civil rights, and so on. And I think that's sort of the trajectory of the country. And obviously progress isn't just always a straight line. But, I think that eventually we will get there, because people realize the benefits of being a lot more inclusive over a long period of time. I think you're right that we've always been divided. And I think we have to parse the different kinds of polarization that we're experiencing. There's the political polarization, which is the ideological differences, or distance between, parties. And we've always had that. If anything at all, we've actually gotten a little bit closer in terms of our views and on things, like the environment and so on. But what's changing now is the toxic polarization that we talk about, which is a distrust and dislike of each other. Because it used to be that, well, I don't share those views. No, I don't like that. I disagree with that stuff, but that's okay, right? You're still my neighbor, and yeah, we can still hang out and that kind of thing. Now it's like, your daughter is a Democrat, my son is a Republican. No, well, that they can't get married, or they shouldn't, or there's this impression that it's a bad thing, right? And obviously there are some issues with the data, and we have to dig a little bit deeper and so on and so forth. But if that's the initial impression, I think that's not great. And that's a place where we've never been.
I think too, though, Ben, that there's not like an end, like I'm sure you're not stuck on this of having like an end point or an end goal of what would a pluralistic, multicultural, and multi-ethnic democracy look like. I think it's going to continue to evolve. And we're actually in a really exciting moment, as painful as it is, where so many grievances are being aired. And social media in one way is a powerful tool to really open up that space for more people to be able to share publicly what they themselves have gone through. Of course, it can be co-opted and then like built around to, stir the pot around polarization. But we are getting the chance to really expand the conversation. In the past, America, the United States, has really limited whose stories get to be told and how they get to be told and who gets to be a part of the conversation. And that's changing, and it needs to change, and it's painful and it's hard and it can be threatening if you're no longer the only people at the table, or if that is looking and feeling different, and the conversation might be different than it has been in the last 20 years. And 20 years from now, it will be really different, right? And we'll continue to evolve as a country. But this is especially as we're going into this really intense year of elections globally, the United States is going to be very much so spotlighted, and how we navigate this in our communities and as, broader nationally. And really, I think that part of the conversation needs to be just inclusive over exclusive, also, and over, having one particular pathway forward or one particular frame that is true.
I want to leave some time to talk about what we're going to do about all this. But first, let me ask, I'd love your impressions on how much you think our shift toward a more remote world, where we are mediated by screens, where we are face-to-face so much less. We are not in workplaces where we might have rubbed shoulders with all these different people and we got to know them and they were in the lunchroom or whatever. We are now so much increasingly deprived of those blending workplaces. That's very new. What do y'all think of that?
It's hard. It's hard.
And we should talk about Bob Talisa's stuff, though. That's his whole thing, is that.
Yeah. I mean, I also read recently that there are two places where we have the most mingling of different socioeconomic groups. It is, I think, Applebee's and Chili's. And so we are definitely sorting ourselves into like-minded spaces geographically and also virtually. And so if you don't encounter, people with different viewpoints, than yours, it's harder to engage, and I think that the more you spend time, as Bob Talise would say, the more you spend time with people who agree with you on everything, the more your views become a bit stronger, more crystallized, even more radical at some points, and you begin to swap your more benign views for more extreme ones. And it can happen with the simplest thing, whether it's the altitude of Colorado or guns or whatever. And so that's something that we all have to be mindful of and think about as we consider what a robust pluralistic democracy ought to look like. So yeah, it's a challenge.
One of the things that Bob talks about also is how he lives in Nashville. He's a professor at Vanderbilt. And he talks about going to the honky tonk bar, like the local like bar, where it's like people don't know he's like a PhD in political science. He is there to listen to the jams and like just really enjoy the beer and the popcorn. It's a beer and popcorn place. And, you know, and everybody's talking about who's amazing on the guitar and like seeking out, he talks about like seeking out those places that are like post-political, you know, where you can know that you have different views than the people around you, but still coexist in like loving civil society. And that might be me putting my a little bit rose-colored glasses on it, but like I do think he does talk about that, and I think that's
Yeah.
I think more of that, less of isolation.
I mean, the Attorney General's, I think, spot on that we're in a crisis of isolation right now. I mean, especially post-pandemic. I'm a parent. I think everyone maybe here, most of us might be parents too, and just getting to see how much impact that isolation has had. I think we're going to continue to see the longer term impact on this generation, but it is true that we are so deeply segregated and or self-segregated or siloed, however we want to frame it. And it has these ripple impacts on our mental health that like it's almost stressful to have to, it is stressful to have to put ourselves outside of our comfort zone of people that we know, kind of think like us, that have same vibes, same culture, whatever, that it's easy, right? Yeah. But it is so important for our whole selves, like for generations beyond us, for us to really break out of that shell and do exactly, Kristi, what you're talking about of like habitually being like, all right, I'm going to like go to this cafe that I don't normally go to, or I'm going to like go outside of my block and walk and try to chat up a neighbor or something like that. That is just seems so trivial and simple, but we know also that like these micro social interactions are so good for our whole mental health. They like give us a little dopamine rush and more joy and start to corrode some of that distrust that Ben was talking about earlier, just through like simple small talk, which I know is, you know, it sounds simple and like rose colored, but it is a fundamentally important part of being a human is having cross group social interactions.
I have some of my best. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm just going to say I've heard two things you've suggested: post-political spaces and those micro-social interactions. What else? This is, I know the audience is saying, what do we do? So I don't know, Ben, were you going to pick that up, I hope?
No, I was going to say that I've had some of my best conversations at airports with random people, strangers that, you know, never met before, but it's great. And sometimes you leave those conversations feeling really, really good about the country. And, you know, Bob Talese will say that we have to form these civic friendships, right? You have to find things to do with other people that have nothing to do with our politics, or that our politics are irrelevant in those circumstances. And, you know, if you're in the audience, you're thinking, what can I do that has nothing to do with politics? Then that's part of the problem, because every aspect of our lives is sort of saturated with politics, and we have to work hard to kind of work our ways out of that.
One of the things that I love so much about the film, Undivide US, is showing, you know, like bringing people together, make somebody a whole person that's so complicated and multifaceted, like every single one of us is. And when we restrict ourselves to like our partisan views or beliefs, we're creating this like linear idea of people that is just not how we are, right? I mean, we can start liking somebody just by the way that they move their hands or the way they move their head. Like there's so many different layers of how we build relationships. And relationships really are, I think, and, you know, social and behavioral science really show that relationships are key to moving through conflict and deep division. So back onto your list, Scott, I would add like trying to build relationships and nurturing across, you know, people that disagree with you, those relationships, even if it's just about being a parent, it's about volunteering for something together, to plant trees, whatever it may be. There's so many different ways of building and nurturing relationships and getting to see and recognize each other in the layers to their views as well.
It's interesting. So in the film, we did a few things to foster each of these things, and the last thing that I would add, or one more thing, would be to seek to understand rather than to be understood. But the, Jasmine, what you're talking about, like some of those, like those tendrils of relationship, when people were coming into the space, we had like coffee and bagels for them, or muffins, as they're sitting around, and they start to talk to one another, and they were freaked out. They knew they were coming here to talk about stuff, but they start, hey, where are you from? This is weird. What are you doing here? All these little social interactions, right, that start to like take away whatever their judgment might have been just by looking at someone, right? And then they're sitting at a table, and in the film, for anyone who hasn't seen it, we start out with an easy question: do you like cats or do you like dogs? And you raise the paddle, one or the other. And then rather than say, here's why I love dogs and think dogs are so the best, when you have to take the perspective of the other person and say, well, so you like dogs, but can you tell me why you think Jasmine might think cats are amazing? And then I have to say, oh, okay, let me think about that. Okay, now cats are clearly, in my head, I might be thinking they're inferior to dogs, right? But they are warm and loving. And, I'm putting myself into your shoes. And even though it's not my opinion and I don't have to change my mind, it humanizes everything about you as a human being. And I think that that the combination of those like tendrils to the taking the perspective of someone else to all the other stuff we're talking about, I don't know, I think there's like a magic in that.
I would say if you can take a break from national news from time to time, that's okay.
A little media fast.
Yeah, I think it's okay. Yeah, take a break from social. I love all of these things, social media, wonderful, but it's okay to take a break from these things from time to time and just reset.
I know I've heard that some doctors in Japan are, prescribing 20 minutes in nature or just time outside just to reconnect.
Isn't that called green bathing or something like that?
So.
Green
earthing.
I like that.
Nature's. So I've got 7 things so far. I love this. I've actually got a list of 7 things, but sort of related to that, how do we also learn to respectfully disagree? I mean, all these 7 things are kind of like seeing other people and forming relationships, but we are going to disagree. Many of us don't have the tools, or many people do not have those tools. They might have been raised to say, like, don't talk about politics and religion, but now people do need to talk about it. What about thoughts on that? On when we do disagree, how do we navigate that?
I mean, I think it helps to have the relationship first. If you're going to be, having a confrontation or a conversation with somebody, having, some shared trust, shared relationship is obviously ideal. That doesn't unfortunately happen in most of the spaces that we're seeing the hottest conversations, the most polarizing rhetoric being shared. And so I think part of that encouragement from our end and what the research shows is, like starting with yourself and building up your own like reflexive muscles around empathy and compassion, and starting to do some internal reflection around, like, what does it feel like to be othered? What does it feel like to be humiliated, to be shamed? So many of the conditions of the conversations that we're seeing include elements of that, of dehumanization and humiliation that are just reducing people and immediately triggering a threat response, and for people to be reactive over responsive. So taking those moments as much as we're able to really align with like our own experiences as people, and to have that goal at the forefront of connecting with someone as a human that has layers that maybe we don't actually know everything that they think and believe. And what a shock, right? To uncover, but opening and also, like leaning within that to Kristi, I think it was you who was pointing this out, of being curious and approaching conversations with curiosity, because that's how I would want to be met with a disagreement, is for somebody to be more curious over prescriptive and knowing what I really think and what my experiences have been.
Yeah, I mean, I would highlight Adam Grant's book, Think Again. He says that oftentimes when we are in a conversation that is about our strongest, deepest ideas and sometimes beliefs, we become either preachers, prosecutors, or politicians. And, the preacher has to sort of evangelize, they have to proselytize and make sure everyone gets to their side. So they are unyielding in their faith. The prosecutor is trying to exploit the weaknesses in the other person's arguments to make theirs look really, really good. And then the politician will obviously say anything to get, folks on their side, both of them. He says, you don't want to be any of these three things. And we've all been in situations where we've been, in any of these three categories. I when it comes to Gladiator, and I'm all three. I think it's the best movie of all time. But he says the fourth thing you want to be is you want to be like a scientist, right? Like a conversational scientist, where you're asking questions, you're being curious, you're saying, tell me more. I'd love to learn more, right? These are important ways of engaging with people across differences. For our pluralist labs, we have three core principles. The first is respect, that we are one another's dignified equals. You have every right to be here as much as I do. And so if we are in this place and we're sharing this space, we're going to respect one another. Number two is authenticity. We're not going to mask our views, because we can't have a genuine conversations if we are masking our views. So we're going to be as authentic as possible and as honest as possible. And then number three is curiosity. So it's important to think about these things. And John and Ozzy would say that great empathetic discourse and civil discourse happens when civic responsibility and civic grace intersect. You want to find that intersection where you are being as candid and as honest about what you're sharing as much as possible, but you're being kind alongside. And so, anyway.
So I've got 7 on one side and 5 on another for disagreements. I love this. This is fantastic. I know we have some questions coming from the audience, so we definitely want to hear what people who have been listening in have to say. So Veronica, I know you are going to help us out with us here shortly. If you would let us know what questions you have. Beautiful. It seems like folks are much more nuanced in their beliefs and closer to each other than what we see in the media. Is there room for a center to reestablish itself? Anyone want to start with that?
It's interesting. I think about this question because I think that I was thinking about our guns conversation that we had, and the interesting thing is you had one guy who was very much said that guns do more good than they do harm, and you had 4 people who said guns do more harm than they do good. And so if you're thinking about a national conversation, okay, those are the 2 sides that we've got, right? But then when you get into the nuances of the conversation, there was a lot of discussion, that part of stuff that didn't end up being in the film, around what is a responsible gun owner? And you saw some of this come out. What is a responsible gun owner? Should people be able to buy, I'm not a gun person, so like AK-47s or whatever I'm getting wrong, automatic weapons on the internet, should you be able to have these kind of military, where are the limits and where are the guidelines? And there was much more like constructive conversation around those things. Now, when you go back and then ask people, did you change your position? Nobody changes their position about whether they think it's done more harm or more good, right? People maintain their quote unquote positions. But when we actually are on a community level having real life discussions about nuanced policies, suddenly there is more agreement. So it's just interesting, because often I think people sometimes get alienated from the bridging conversations because they're like, I don't want to bridge. I don't want to change my position. I believe I am right. But that language doesn't acknowledge the nuances. So I think it's tricky, but I think we have to think about what our goals are. Are our goals to move people, or are our goals to like settle down, think about what the real issues are, and have like constructive conversations. I think that might be a better way to frame it up from a PR perspective in terms of like how you think about these issues.
Yeah, I think, I agree. I love the like PR angle here too. But I think that the center is already here. And so I don't think it's like a reestablishment. Like all of the, beyond conflict, we've done research with researchers at UPenn, at UIC, University of Illinois, Chicago, and NYU and University of Utah now, where it consistently shows that people have way exaggerated misperceptions of people on the other side, particularly around how much they dislike them on even key policy issues. And the biggest kind of tricky one is around how much they dehumanize and don't recognize the full humanity of these of partisans. And we're looking specifically at Democrats and Republicans consistently, again and again. Us, other organizations that are doing similar research show that the majority of Americans are really in the center, whether that's a little to the right, a little bit to the left. It is the majority, and so part of it is having conversations like this become more normalized and more mainstreamed in the universe that is media, to really break down the silos and correct this mass misperceptions that we have that are just further inflamed by polarizing rhetoric on mainstream media, that we see also leveraged on social media in our own tiny little silos as individuals within these networks. And I think that will help to reestablish, or not reestablish, but reaffirm that we are here, that it is here, and that that's actually the norm for us.
And I think the center has to realize how much power it has. I think that's the biggest challenge. If you look at the primaries, for instance, only about 10-15% or so of Americans actually vote in primaries. And the primaries are ones where it's the most people who are most exercised about the issues, who also tend to be a bit more polarized about the issues, are the ones who are engaged and they're voting. And so they serve up options that most Americans eventually say, we don't like any of these options. But, they have to rise up and get more involved, not always politically, but in conversations, in public square and so on. So that they have to realize how much power they have.
One thing I've noticed is most Americans seem to grossly overestimate the percentages of Democrats and Republicans in our population. It's maybe a third of the population for each party, if my research is correct. And so when you'll hear about, 20% of the Republican Party or the Democratic Party support something, and I'll think, that's a pretty small number. But, most Americans picture half the nation as this big block, and it's really miscommunication. So if I hear Kristi right, we're really already kind of in the center if we understand the nuances and just not the sound bites. If we really pierce under the surface, we're probably already existing in the center. Is that really what you're saying?
That's not what I'm saying so much. I more think that we think that we have, I think people are very attached to their labels and to their tribes, and that they don't like to feel like they're being asked to move their position. I think if the conversations are framed up around having constructive conversations around specific topics, where we're looking for policy solutions that can move us forward, I feel like that's a better way to frame a conversation, where people from both the right and the left who might actually have different views on something can come together and be like, oh, here's how we can create change in our community that's constructive. I think if you frame it up as that it's centrist, I think that might not work politically. that's where I'm resistant to that a little bit, just because I worry it won't work.
Veronica, I think we have another question. Having been denied a completely peaceful transfer of power in 2021, the January 6th Capitol attack casts a long shadow over the 2024 cycle. How can we heal from that? Who wants to start that one off?
I feel like that's Justine.
I was going to say, you're in the healing business, I think.
Time will help.
Yeah.
I think time will help, as they say. Time heals all wounds. But I think that conversations at the appropriate times. Some conversations cannot be had in the immediate aftermath of a particular, incident. You can't do that. But eventually, when people have calmed down a little bit, I think those conversations can be had.
I think too about, there's scales of how can we heal from this. There's, the individual scale, there's within our community, there's the structural and systemic scale. And I think that healing is going to look really different at different levels, right? And Kristi, as you were just talking, tying into this question, I was thinking about how common it is for people, to not be willing to come to the table because they're worried that working across aisles of differences is really abandoning their values and their principles, and is a betrayal not only to themselves, but their family, what they've worked hard for, their legacies that they're building off of. And we don't want that, right? We want people to come to the table and bring that with them, to Ben, your point around authenticity. Like, that is what really is the gold of this great experiment of bringing in our diversity, is all of these different layers of ourselves. And part of healing takes each of us to really hold ourselves accountable to recognizing that fullness of people's own stories. Another piece is, and this ties into the other question as well, but is really like the power of storytelling, and the power of if we're not able to bring people together like y'all were able to do with this great film, like researchers have been doing around perceptions. Part of it is just sharing each other's stories, because that creates vicarious contact. And some of Beyond Conflict's work in West Africa and Nigeria specifically has been doing media interventions around intergroup conflict and reducing these threat perceptions and dehumanization of others. And it's not safe enough to bring people to the table or to bring people to the conversation face to face in some circumstances. And it's not sensitive in a lot of circumstances after, terrible things or atrocities happen. But we can expose people to one another and expose the layers of, I was having a bad day at work and my kid got sick and I missed a meeting and then I ran into you and this happened, right? Yeah. There's always layers that are underpinning a lot of our responses in conflict, and that exacerbate our conflict reactivities. And so just creating more spaciousness and grace really for one another to show up authentically. I think, as much as we can in our own corner of the woods, corner of the country, whatever, in our day-to-day lives is one really powerful way that we can heal from this. And also encouraging our elected officials and holding our elected officials accountable to also create more spaciousness for other perspectives. And whether or not your elected representatives and senators are supporting bipartisan legislation, we know that members of Congress that get the most airtime are the most polarizing, who, really emphasize this like in-group, in-party mentality. But the reality is most of our congressional members aren't doing that. And so, amplifying your members of Congress's statements, et cetera, that aren't polarizing, and then encouraging, if you do happen to have representatives or senators who are contributing to that polarizing rhetoric, call them in and encourage a different type of discourse.
Mm-hmm. There's a huge coalition. The Listen First Coalition has a lot, and part of that coalition is the National Governors Association, and they actually have like a Democrat who's the governor of Colorado and a Republican who's the governor of Utah, and they come together and they've done ads together to try to kind of basically model exactly what you're saying, Jasmine. And I think that's a good organization to.
I think it's their Disagree Better campaign.
Yeah, it's hashtag disagree better. And you'll notice everything for the film, we try to hashtag that too, just because we want that to be more of something that we're like, elevating.
Absolutely. And I was going to say, I know there's a lot of resources on your website for the film too, Kristi, on some of these things. So that's certainly there. Okay, yeah. We can take one more question. Thank you for this wonderful discussion. How can the Museum of Political Corruption address the topic of corruption in a way that can unite us? So I think that's a recommendations for the museum. What kinds of things could a museum do to help address this, to unite us?
More conversations like this. And honestly, if every person who's on this call would have a conversation with 5 of your friends, or everybody can host a screening of Undivide Us if they want to. Go to the website, undivideusmovie.com. But we're agnostic. Like, we're excited to do film screenings because that's what we know how to do. That's what I knew how to do to help, right? But like, take action. That's what my deepest hope of my heart is, like, that we all would like realize that we actually have a lot more power than we might feel when we're walking through our everyday lives, that we have the power to engage with our local communities and to try to make this better. But Jasmine and Ben, you might have better ideas than me.
Not better, just additional.
Additional, and
I mean, I'm thinking about corruption, and it's a tricky one. I mean, obviously I've been talking a lot about threat because that's where my work kind of really lives, and specifically around identity threat and social identity. And I think about, like, if you're someone who might be sympathetic to some of the tactics that what somebody else might call corrupt, that's automatically going to just like create barriers to the conversation and limit the potential for cooperation, for mutual respect, et cetera, et cetera. And so part of, I think, the role that institutions like the Museum of Political Corruption can take is really being really sensitive to language and framing, and creating, again, like more curiosity, more exploration, more, questions that people can take with them to do some self-reflection. And part of that can also be around like confirmation bias. Most of us are just more likely to support and agree with things that we think are true, that like support our values and our perspectives. But that's not always true, right? That can just be confirming our biases. And I think museums in particular have a really powerful place in correcting misperceptions and also addressing some of our incorrect biases, and challenging us to, broaden our perspectives and be more open to other, not just other views, but really other people.
I mean, the only thing I might add is this, something I think we don't probably talk about enough is virtues. And so, hosting conversations around, virtues. What does justice look like? What does prudence look like? Honesty, and how do they play key roles in our political lives? And I think that can help tease out some good conversations about where, when those virtues are corrupted, what do we see? Is that beneficial to our communities? So what do we want? How do we, pick people with the right kinds of virtues, regardless of what's out of the, political spectrum that they're on? I think some deep conversations around these could be helpful.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. That would be a wonderful conversation for sure. Any last remarks before we turn to our next event? But any last remarks?
The one thing I might add is just, there are important issues and challenges, whether it's healthcare or the environment or, inflation, what have you. All these are important, but not every issue is existential. And so we have to be wary of, conflict entrepreneurs who always tell us that something is existential and we are under serious threat from the other guy. We always have to be skeptical of that.
Mm-hmm. I echo that. I mean, I think that just keeps us, that keeps us in a stress response if we are constantly inundated. And that is what like authoritarians do and populist regimes oftentimes do, is keep people in this constant cycle of fear and crisis. And that just reduces and limits our ability to think clearly and to think creatively, which is exactly what we need in these moments where we're faced with some really big, serious challenges, some less severe challenges, but being able to kind of sort through and filter out what is noise and what is true and what is really an issue, can help us to, move away from a lot of our black and white and linear thinking that happens when we are collectively and individually really just stressed out.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you, Jasmine, for all the work you do. And thank you, Ben and Kristi, so much for making this film, for putting these people together, and of course, for coming in on this conversation with us. We really, really appreciate it. For the audience listening in, we have a little bit of a preview of what's coming up on May 23rd. We do have a film called What is Democracy? So I think these conversations will continue in just one other way. And you're about to see a short preview of that.
Do you live in a democracy?
Yes, absolutely.
Do you vote?
No. No, I do not.
If there's one issue you think is undermining our democracy, what is it?
Great question.
Everywhere you look, democracy is in trouble.
How do you make democracy out of an undemocratic people? That's our problem today.
Democracy, it doesn't feel like this in my head. It doesn't feel like being scared for my life.
أنا من حلب أيمن الأيامي. أنا تركت أهلي بسوريا ما بعرف عنهم شيء.
Plato's Republic provides the most powerful indictment of not just democratic practices, but the possibility of democracy.
Plato says in the Republic, in Book 8, that rich people want to become richer.
And wealthy oligarchs know that they cannot hold on to power in truly democratic elections.
It's been so abused and so misapplied compared to its original meaning, which means the power of the people.
So many of the problems we're confronting are a direct consequence of the fact that slavery was never fully abolished.
If we are going to struggle to make a better world, a more democratic world, we all first must agree that all lives has equal value.
So we're still wrestling with Plato's challenge. Plato's challenge will never go away. Will never go away.
I can't wait for this one. Thank you so much. And thank you all for joining us. Thank you all for joining us. I can't wait to see that. Do watch your email. Find us on social media. We'll be having these conversations all year. So thank you once again, and we look forward to seeing you next time.